The abandoned campsite. The group of friends had been planning their camping trip for weeks, excited to escape the hustle and bustle of their daily lives and spend a few days in the quiet of nature. They arrived at the campground and set up their tents, but as they began to explore their surroundings, they stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The site looked as if it had been left in a hurry. A tent was still pitched, but it was torn and tattered. A few cooking utensils were scattered around, and a small campfire was still smoldering, but there was no sign of the campers who had left everything behind. Curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to investigate. As they looked closer, they noticed something strange. The tent was torn from the inside, and the cooking utensils were scattered as if they had been dropped in a hurry. It was as if the campers had fled in a panic. As they discussed the possible reasons for the hasty departure, they began to hear strange noises coming from the woods around them. At first, it was just a rustling of leaves, but it quickly escalated to eerie whispers and the sound of footsteps. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the campsite, and the friends jumped in fear. They realized that they were not alone in the woods and whatever was out there was watching them. As the night wore on, the noises became more persistent and the shadows more frequent. The friends huddled together in their tents, trying to calm their nerves, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the morning, they decided to pack up and leave, but as they began to break camp, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. On the tree next to the abandoned campsite was a message carved deep into the bark. "You're next." The group quickly packed up their gear and fled the woods, never looking back. They never found out what happened to the previous occupants of the abandoned campsite, but they knew that they had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The woods held secrets they never wanted to uncover again, and they vowed to never return to the cursed place. As they drove away, the group of friends couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. They couldn't see anything in their rearview mirror, but they could sense a presence behind them. The drive back to civilization was long and tense, with each passing mile feeling like an eternity. They tried to distract themselves with music and conversation, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, they arrived back in town and breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they were safe, but they were wrong. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects in their homes would move on their own, doors would open and close by themselves, and eerie whispers would fill the air. The four friends soon realized that they had brought something back with them from the woods. They had disturbed something that should have been left alone, and now it was seeking revenge. They sought the help of a local psychic, who told them the chilling truth. The abandoned campsite was the site of a gruesome murder-suicide, and the spirits of the victims were still haunting the woods. The group of friends knew that they had to face their fears head-on if they wanted to put an end to the haunting. They returned to the woods with a psychic, armed with sage and holy water. As they entered the woods, they could feel the malevolent presence around them, but they were determined to put an end to it. They reached the abandoned campsite and performed a cleansing ritual. As they did so, they could hear the spirits screaming and crying out in rage. Finally, the ritual was complete, and the group of friends felt the weight of the haunting lift from their shoulders. They knew that they had put an end to the curse of the abandoned campsite. From that day forward, they never spoke of the haunting again, but they knew that the memory of that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Campfire Ghost Story. The teenagers huddled closer together, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of the campfire. The night was dark, the woods around them quiet and still. It was the perfect setting for a ghost story. One of the teenagers, a boy named Jake, began to tell a tale. It was a story he had heard from his grandfather about a phantom camper who haunted the woods. According to the story, the phantom camper was a lost soul who had died in the woods many years ago. He was doomed to wander the forest, searching for his way home, and when he encountered campers, he would terrorize them, feeding on their fear and stealing their souls. At first, the other teenagers laughed and jeered at the story, calling it a bunch of hooey. But as Jake continued to speak, they began to feel a chill creeping up their spines. Suddenly, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They turned to look but saw nothing. Then they heard a twig snap, and then another. The teenagers looked around nervously, their eyes wide with fear. "Is someone there?" one of them called out. There was no answer, but then they saw something moving in the darkness. It was a figure, tall and dark, moving toward them. The teenagers screamed and scrambled to their feet, backing away from the approaching figure. And then they saw what it was. It was a camper, just like the one Jake had described in his story. And as they watched, the door opened and a figure stepped out. It was the phantom camper. The teenagers tried to run, but they found that they couldn't move. They were frozen in place, trapped by the phantom's gaze. The camper approached them, its windows black and empty, and then it vanished into thin air, leaving the teenagers alone in the darkness. The teenagers stumbled back to their tents, shaken and terrified. They knew that they had encountered something beyond their understanding, something that defied explanation. And as they huddled together in their sleeping bags, they knew that they would never forget the terror of that night, the night they encountered the phantom camper in the woods. As the night wore on, the teenagers tried to convince themselves that it had just been a trick of the mind, a collective hallucination brought on by the spooky campfire story. But as they drifted off to sleep, they were all plagued by terrible nightmares. They dreamed of the phantom camper, of its dark windows and sinister presence. The next morning, they packed up their campsite and left the woods behind, eager to put the experience behind them. But as they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, still lurking in the shadows. And as they looked back at the woods, they saw something that made their blood run cold. They saw the camper parked by the side of the road, watching them with its dark, empty windows. The teenagers screamed and had the driver to speed away, but the camper seemed to be following them, always just out of reach. For hours, they drove through the winding country roads, trying to escape the phantom camper's grasp, but no matter how fast they drove, it always seemed to be there waiting for them. As the sun began to set, they found themselves back in the woods, surrounded by darkness and silence, and then they saw the camper again, parked just ahead of them on the road. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The phantom camper had them trapped. As they approached the camper, its door creaked open, inviting them in, and without knowing why, the teenagers stepped inside, knowing that they were sealing their fate. The camper rumbled to life, its engine roaring to life, and then it vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of the teenagers behind. And as the night fell over the woods, the only sound that could be heard was the distant echo of the phantom camper's engine, a haunting reminder of the terror that lay hidden in the darkness. The haunted Verve. The family was thrilled when they bought the used Verve, eager for a summer vacation filled with adventure and exploration. But as soon as they hit the road, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small things, a flickering light, a strange noise in the middle of the night. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. The family felt like they were being watched, like something was lurking inside the Verve with them. They tried to brush it off, telling themselves that it was just their imagination running wild. But as they delved deeper into the history of the Verve, they realized that something was not quite right with their new purchase. They discovered that the previous owners had met a tragic end, and that the Verve had been involved in a terrible accident. As the family dug deeper, they uncovered more and more disturbing secrets about the Verve's past. They began to feel like they were being drawn into a dark and twisted world, one that they could never escape from. And then one night it happened. The Verve seemed to take on a life of its own, trapping the family inside and refusing to let them go. They were plunged into a nightmare world of shadows and ghosts, forced to confront the dark past of the Verve's previous owners. As the family struggled to escape the Verve's grasp, they realized that they were not alone. The ghost of the previous owners was still hunting the Verve, seeking revenge on those who had caused their untimely demise. The family was trapped, their only hope of survival to confront the ghost and lay the past to rest. But could they do it? Could they face the dark forces that were closing in on them, or would they succumb to the Verve's malevolent power? As the family fought for their lives, they knew that they were in a battle for their very souls. The haunted Verve was determined to claim them, to make them a part of its dark legacy, and they knew that only one side could emerge victorious. The family huddled together, their hearts racing with fear and anticipation as they prepared to confront the dark forces that surrounded them. They knew that they had to be strong, that they had to face their fears head-on if they were to have any chance of surviving the night. The Verve creaked and groaned, its metal body trembling as the ghosts of the previous owners closed in on the family. They could hear their voices whispering in the darkness, taunting them with their chilling cries. But the family refused to back down. They knew that they had to be brave, that they had to stand up to the ghost and face their darkest fears if they were to have any hope of surviving. As the ghost closed in, the family summoned their courage and began to fight back. They brandished weapons, swinging them wildly at the phantoms that surrounded them. At first, it seemed like they were making progress. The ghosts backed off, retreating into the shadows as the family fought back with all their might. But then things took a turn for the worse. The verve began to shake violently, its metal body twisting and turning as the ghosts fought back with renewed vigor. The family was thrown to the ground, their weapons clattering to the floor as the verve's interior was plunged into darkness. They could hear the ghosts laughing, their voices echoing through the night as they closed in for the final kill. But just when all seemed lost, something miraculous happened. A beam of light burst through the darkness, illuminating the verve's interior and banishing the ghosts back to the shadows. The family looked up awestruck as they saw a figure standing in the doorway of the verve. It was a priest, his face kind and compassionate as he gazed at the family with a knowing smile. He beckoned them to him, and the family crawled toward him, their hearts full of gratitude and relief. He took them in his arms, shielding them from the darkness that still lurked around them. And then, with a wave of his hand, he banished the ghosts once and for all, sending them back to the afterlife where they belonged. The family looked at the priest with wonder and awe, grateful for his intervention and his compassion. They knew that they had been given a second chance, that they had been saved from the darkness that had threatened to consume them. And as they drove away from the haunted verve, they knew that they would never forget the lessons they had learned. They knew that they had been given a gift, and that they would always be grateful for the light that had shone in the darkness. The spirit of the lake. The young couple arrived at the remote lake, eager for a romantic getaway. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over tranquil waters. They rented a small cabin by the lake and settled in for a few days of peace and quiet. As they explored the lake, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They heard whispers on the wind and caught glimpses of something moving in the shadows. As night fell, they built a campfire by the lake and settled in for the evening. That's when they heard the story of the drowned camper, a young man who had perished in the lake many years ago. The young couple tried to brush off the story as a silly legend, but as they drifted off to sleep in their cabin, they began to experience strange visions. They saw the young man drowning in the lake, who was struggling to stay afloat. They heard his anguished screams as he slipped beneath the water. The next day, they tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over the lake. But as they spent more time there, the visions grew stronger and more vivid. They saw the young man's face in the ripples of the water, heard his voice in the rustling of the leaves. They tried to leave, but the spirit of the lake would not let them go. The water churned and roiled, pulling them back towards the shore. They tried to swim away, but the waves grew stronger, threatening to drag them under. As the sun began to set, the young couple realized that they were trapped. They were trapped by the spirit of the lake, doomed to spend eternity in its dark and murky depths. And as they screamed and struggled, the water closed over their heads, silencing their cries forever. The lake grew calm once more, its dark waters hiding the terrible secrets that lay buried beneath the surface. The next day, the cabin remained empty with no sign of the young couple. A search party was organized, but they found no trace of the couple on land or in the water. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear their screams echoing across the lake, and see their faces in the dark waters. And if you're brave enough to venture to the shore, you might catch a glimpse of the spirit of the lake, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to claim its next victims. The legend of the drowned camper lives on, warning all those who dare to visit the remote lake to beware the spirits that dwell within its depths. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a dark and stormy night when the lone traveler was driving through a remote stretch of highway. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind was howling through the trees. It was the perfect night for a horror story. As he drove along, he saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a hitchhiker, drenched from head to toe and shivering in the cold. The traveler felt sorry for him and pulled over to offer a ride. The hitchhiker got in and they began to chat. He seemed friendly enough, and the traveler was glad for the company on such a lonely stretch of road. But as they drove, the traveler began to notice something strange. The hitchhiker never gave his name, and he never talked about where he was going. He just sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, and occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to the traveler's questions. As they drove deeper into the night, The traveler began to feel uneasy. There was something off about the hitchhiker, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Finally, they reached a small town, and the hitchhiker asked to be let out. The traveler obliged and watched as the hitchhiker walked into the darkness. As he drove away, the traveler realized that he had never asked for the hitchhiker's name or where he was going. He couldn't even remember what the hitchhiker looked like. The next day, the traveler stopped at a local diner and told his story to the locals. They looked at him with sympathy and told him that he had just encountered the Vanishing Hitchhiker. The Vanishing Hitchhiker was a ghost that haunted the road, appearing to lone travelers on dark and stormy nights. He would ask for a ride, and once he reached his destination, he would disappear into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The traveler was spooked by the story, but thought little of it until he drove back down the same stretch of road a few weeks later. As he drove, he saw a figure on the side of the road. It was the hitchhiker, soaked and shivering in the cold. The traveler felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that he had picked up a ghost. He quickly drove away, but he could hear the hitchhiker's ghostly laughter echoing through the night. From that day forward, the traveler never drove down that stretch of road again. He knew that the Vanishing Hitchhiker was still out there, haunting the road and waiting for his next victim. Despite his fear, the traveler couldn't stop thinking about the Vanishing Hitchhiker. He became obsessed with finding out more about the ghostly figure and the stories surrounding him. He searched the local archives and talked to the locals, trying to piece together the history of the Vanishing Hitchhiker. He learned that the ghost had been haunting the road for decades, appearing to lone travelers and causing them to vanish without a trace. The traveler knew that he had to confront the Vanishing Hitchhiker if he wanted to put an end to the haunting. He returned to the road, armed with a camera and a voice recorder, determined to capture evidence of the ghostly figure. As he drove, he saw the hitchhiker on the side of the road once again. But this time, he was ready. He pulled over, and the hitchhiker got in. They drove along, and the traveler asked the hitchhiker questions, trying to get him to reveal his true identity, but the hitchhiker remained elusive, only giving vague answers. Finally, they reached the hitchhiker's destination, and the traveler grabbed his camera and voice recorder. He took pictures of the hitchhiker and recorded their conversation. As the hitchhiker got out of the car, the traveler called out his name. To his surprise, the hitchhiker turned around and looked directly at him. But before he could say anything else, the hitchhiker vanished into thin air. The traveler was left standing there, staring at the empty road. But when he reviewed the pictures and the recording, he found something chilling. In the pictures, the hitchhiker appeared as a ghostly figure, almost transparent. And on the recording, he could hear the hitchhiker's voice distorted and filled with static. The traveler knew that he had finally captured evidence of the Vanishing Hitchhiker. He shared his story and his evidence with the world, and the ghostly figure became famous. But the traveler knew the truth. He knew that the Vanishing Hitchhiker was still out there, haunting the road and waiting for his next victim. And he knew that he had come too close to the ghostly figure, and that he might not be so lucky the next time he encountered him.